My name is Margaret Halden, and I was 29 years old the day I stood at the end of an aisle with 40 guests and 2 empty chairs in the front row. I want you to picture those chairs, because I have never quite been able to stop picturing them myself. White folding chairs with little bows tied to the back, the same as every other chair in that garden, except that the 2 directly in front of me, the ones reserved with printed cards that said Mother of the Bride and Father of the Bride, sat empty through the entire ceremony. My Aunt Louise sat 2 rows back, dabbing her eyes, not from joy, but from the particular grief of watching her sister's absence become the loudest thing in the room. I walked down that aisle on the arm of my Uncle Frank because there was no one else left to ask, and I said my vows to a man I loved with my whole heart, while 2 folding chairs sat empty in front of me like a sentence I hadn't finished reading yet. My parents were 3 states away that afternoon, sitting in a glass-walled conference room, wiring the last installment of what should have been my wedding fund into my younger brother Caleb's failing startup. I didn't find that out until 2 days later. I want to walk you through exactly how I found out, and everything that came before it, because you need to understand 13 years of my life before you can understand what happened when my brother's company, 8 years after that wedding, submitted an acquisition offer to the very firm I had spent all those years quietly building. Before I tell you more, tell me where you're watching this from and what time it is where you are. I always like knowing that. Now let me take you back to where all of this actually started. I grew up in a house where my brother's future was treated like a public works project and mine was treated like a hobby I'd eventually grow out of. Caleb is 3 years younger than me, and from the time he was in middle school building little circuit boards in the garage, my parents talked about him the way you talk about a sure thing, the golden boy, the one who was going to put our family's name on something important someday. My father, Richard Halden, ran a modest but steady insurance agency for 30 years. My mother, Susan, kept the books for that agency and, in her own quiet way, kept score of everything else in our house too. Who deserved what, who had earned which chance, who was worth the investment, and who wasn't. I remember a specific afternoon when I was 14 and Caleb was 11, sitting at our kitchen table doing homework while my mother went through the mail. There was a school fundraising letter for a science camp Caleb wanted to attend that summer. $400, a real stretch for our family budget at the time. My mother wrote the check that same evening without a moment's hesitation. 2 weeks later, I asked if I could join the debate team, which required a much smaller fee for travel to regional tournaments, and my mother told me she'd have to think about it, that money was tight that month, and in the end I joined anyway, paying the fee myself with babysitting money I'd been saving for something else entirely. I didn't understand, at 14, that this was a pattern rather than a coincidence. I understand it perfectly now. I was the daughter who got good grades without anyone noticing, who paid her own way through state college working 2 jobs, who built a career in operations consulting from the ground up, starting as an entry-level analyst at a mid-sized firm and working her way, slowly and without fanfare, into a role managing client accounts worth millions of dollars. Nobody in my family ever asked me a single detailed question about that work. My mother's questions were always about Caleb. Did I know anyone in venture capital? Did my firm have contacts who might invest? Whether I'd mentioned his company to my boss yet, the way you'd mention a nephew selling raffle tickets for a school fundraiser. Caleb started his company, a logistics software platform called Fenwick Route, when he was 26. I want to be fair to him here, because this isn't a story about my brother being a villain from the very beginning. He was smart, genuinely talented with the technical side of things, and the idea itself, a platform to help small regional trucking companies optimize delivery routes and cut fuel costs, wasn't a bad one. But Caleb had never once in his life had to build anything without a safety net, and it showed in how he ran that company from the first year onward, expensive office space, before there was revenue to justify it, hiring decisions made on gut feeling instead of need, a habit of telling our parents, whenever the numbers looked bad, that he just needed one more round of support to get through to the next milestone. My parents gave him that support, over and over, for years. I didn't know the full extent of it until much later, but I knew enough, even at the time, to notice the pattern. A new car for Caleb the same year my mother told me she and my father couldn't help with my law school tuition, though I ended up not pursuing that path and instead built my career the way I did. A down payment on Caleb's condo the same year my father told me, almost apologetically, that money was tight and they wouldn't be able to contribute much to my wedding when the time came. I met my husband, Nathaniel, when I was 26 at a mutual friend's dinner party. He worked in commercial real estate finance, careful and steady in a way that matched something in me I hadn't realized I was looking for until I found it. We got engaged 2 years later, and I remember calling my mother with the news, expecting, foolishly, the kind of excitement I'd watched her shower on Caleb over every small milestone in his company's early years. She was warm enough on the phone. "Congratulations, so happy for you." But the conversation turned, within minutes, to how Caleb's latest funding round was going, and I hung up that call with the same small, familiar ache I'd been carrying around since I was 12 years old. My parents told me, about 8 months before the wedding, that they had set aside a fund to help cover the costs, an offer I hadn't asked for but was deeply grateful to receive, because Nathaniel and I were paying for most of it ourselves and every bit of help mattered. My mother mentioned a specific number, enough to cover the venue and catering, and I remember the relief I felt hearing it, the small, hopeful thought that maybe, for once, I was going to be treated the way Caleb always had been. I didn't know, and wouldn't find out until 2 days after my wedding, that Fenwick Root had been quietly bleeding cash for nearly a year by that point. That Caleb had come to our parents 4 months before my wedding with a number that would keep the company alive through what he swore was a final rough patch before a major client contract came through, and that my parents, faced with a choice between the wedding fund they'd promised me and the son they had spent 30 years treating as the family's one true investment, chose Caleb without telling me a single word about it. I want to walk you through the wedding day itself, because I think the details matter more than the summary. I remember the morning of the wedding with an unusual clarity, the way you remember days that later turn out to matter far more than you understood while you were living them. I woke up before my alarm, unable to sleep any longer out of nervous excitement, and sat on the edge of the hotel bed for a few minutes, just breathing, thinking about the day ahead, the vows Nathaniel and I had written together, the small garden venue we'd chosen specifically because it felt like us rather than a performance for anyone else. My mother had texted me the night before, a short message wishing me luck and saying she couldn't wait to see me in my dress. I had read that message 3 times, holding on to it the way you hold onto a small, hopeful thing, not yet knowing it was the last message I'd received from her for 2 full days. Nathaniel and I got married in that small garden venue an hour outside the city. 40 guests, string lights, the kind of modest, intimate wedding that felt entirely like us rather than like a performance for anyone else. My mother had called the week before to say she and my father were dealing with what she called a family emergency and might be running slightly late. I didn't think much of it at the time. Emergencies happen. I assumed they'd walk in sometime during the cocktail hour, apologetic and a little flustered, the way people do when a flight gets delayed. They never arrived. Not during the ceremony, not during the reception, not that night, not the next morning. My Aunt Louise, my mother's sister, sat 2 rows back through the entire ceremony, and I remember catching her eye once, right before I started walking down the aisle, and seeing something on her face that I couldn't fully name at the time but would understand completely 2 days later, a mixture of pity and quiet, helpless anger. I called my mother from the parking lot after the reception ended, still in my wedding dress, mascara streaked from crying during the vows, though at the time I told myself those were happy tears. She didn't answer. I called 4 more times over the next 2 days. She finally picked up on a Tuesday afternoon, and her voice had the particular brightness people use when they know they're about to deliver something they'd rather not say out loud. "Margaret, honey, I'm so sorry about Saturday," she said. There was an emergency with Caleb's company. A funding gap that would have shut the whole thing down if we hadn't stepped in immediately. Your father and I had to be at the bank that morning, and then everything just spiraled, and by the time we could have made it, we thought it would be more disruptive to arrive late than not to come at all. I asked her, very quietly, what emergency required liquidating money on the exact morning of my wedding. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I understood, before she even said another word, exactly what had happened. "The wedding fund," she said finally. "We used it to cover Caleb's gap. I know the timing was terrible, Margaret, but you understand, don't you? If we hadn't acted that morning, the company would have folded. Years of his work, gone. You and Nathaniel had already covered the venue yourselves. It wasn't like the day itself was at risk. We just weren't able to be there in person, and I am sorry for that." I sat in my car outside my own apartment, still in the dress I'd worn on the happiest day of my life until that phone call, and I understood, with a clarity I had somehow managed to avoid for 29 years, exactly where I stood in my family's accounting of who deserved investment and who didn't. I didn't scream at her. I didn't cry, not on that call. I said, very evenly, that I needed some time, and I hung up, and I didn't speak to either of my parents again for almost 4 years. I want to tell you about those 4 years, because they are the years that built everything that came after. I threw myself into my work with a kind of focus that surprised even me. Nathaniel was steady and patient through all of it, never once suggesting I should reach out and smooth things over, never once telling me my hurt wasn't justified, which mattered more to me than almost anything else in those early years of our marriage. There were nights, especially in that first year, when the grief of it caught up with me unexpectedly, folding laundry or driving home from work, a sudden wave of missing the parents I'd hoped to have rather than the ones I actually did. Nathaniel never once tried to talk me out of that grief or rush me through it. He just sat with me while I felt it, which I've come to understand is its own kind of quiet love, the kind that doesn't need to fix anything, just needs to stay in the room. I moved from client account management into a more strategic role at my firm, then left, 2 years after the wedding, to start my own operations consulting practice, initially just myself and a laptop, working out of a small rented office above a dry cleaner, the way so many things worth building tend to start. I remember the specific smell of that office, dry cleaning chemicals drifting up through the floorboards, and how I used to joke to Nathaniel that at least my clothes would always be wrinkle-free, even if the business itself never took off. It took off slowly, then steadily, then all at once, the way these things sometimes do when you've stopped waiting for anyone's permission to build them. I named the firm Halden Strategic Partners, my own last name, a decision I made deliberately, quietly, without ever announcing it to my family, because some part of me wanted to build something with the Halden name attached to it that had nothing whatsoever to do with the family that had spent my entire life treating that name as something only my brother could carry forward. The early years were hard in the ordinary way that building something from nothing is always hard. I picked up small clients first, regional manufacturing companies, family-owned distributors, the kind of businesses that needed help modernizing their operations but couldn't afford the large national consulting firms. I worked long hours. I made mistakes and learned from them. I hired my first employee 18 months in, a sharp young analyst named Priya Anand, who would go on to become my firm's chief operating officer and one of the people I trust most in the world. I heard about my family only through my Aunt Louise during those years, careful, occasional updates that I neither sought out nor entirely avoided. Caleb's company survived the crisis. My parents' money had bailed it out of, though only barely, and only for a while. He raised another round 18 months later, then another, each one smaller and harder to close than the last, the kind of pattern that anyone with real operations experience would have recognized immediately as a company running on momentum rather than fundamentals. My parents, Louise told me, had put additional money into the company twice more over those years, smaller amounts each time, quietly, the way people keep doubling down on a bet they've become too invested in to walk away from. I built Halden Strategic Partners into something real over those 4 years, slowly, deliberately, the unglamorous way most lasting things get built. By the time I was 33, the firm had grown to 15 employees and a client roster that included several mid-sized logistics and manufacturing companies across 3 states. I specialized, somewhat by accident and then very much by design, in operational turnarounds, helping struggling companies restructure their processes, cut waste, and become genuinely sustainable rather than simply surviving on borrowed time and borrowed money. My parents reached out again when I was 33, Not with an apology exactly, but with an invitation to my father's 60th birthday party. I almost didn't go. Nathaniel left the decision entirely to me, the way he always did with anything involving my family, and in the end I went, cautiously, because some part of me still wanted to believe things could be different. They weren't, not really, though the visit wasn't a disaster either. My mother hugged me at the door like no time had passed at all, holding on a beat too long, and I remember standing there in the doorway of the house I'd grown up in, feeling the strange, disorienting comfort of a familiar hug from someone who had hurt me more than almost anyone else in my life. Within 20 minutes of arriving, I watched Caleb hold court in the living room, talking about Fenwick Root's latest pivot, some new enterprise software feature he was confident would finally turn the company profitable, while my father nodded along with the same rapt attention he'd given every version of that same speech for the better part of a decade. I stood near the kitchen doorway with a glass of wine. I wasn't really drinking, watching the same dynamic I'd grown up inside of play out one more time, exactly the way it always had, as though the wedding and the 4 years of silence that followed it had simply never happened at all. Nobody asked me a single question about my own firm that entire evening. At one point, my mother did turn to me, mid-conversation with one of her friends, and said, "Margaret does something with businesses too, don't you, honey?" A sentence so vague and so entirely lacking in curiosity that I simply said yes and let the conversation move back to Caleb without further comment. I left early, and I didn't reach out again for another year after that, though I did, cautiously, begin exchanging occasional texts with my mother, careful, surface-level messages that neither repaired nor entirely severed whatever remained between us. I want to tell you about the years that followed, because this is where the story starts moving toward its ending. By the time I was 36, Halden Strategic Partners had grown into a genuinely significant regional firm, 40 employees, a reputation for turning around struggling logistics and manufacturing operations that had started attracting inbound interest from companies I'd never even pitched. I kept my public profile deliberately modest. I didn't do press interviews. I didn't post about the firm on social media beyond the bare minimum needed for basic marketing. Priya, by then my chief operating officer, used to tease me about it, telling me I ran the most successful low-profile consulting firm in the region, and I never fully explained to her why I preferred it that way, though I think she understood well enough without my having to say it out loud. Fenwick Root, meanwhile, had continued its slow, familiar decline. Louise's updates over those years painted a picture I recognized immediately from my own professional experience. A company that had never developed the operational discipline to match its early technical promise, burning through capital faster than it could replace it, cycling through a series of pivots that each generated a brief round of investor optimism before the underlying problems reasserted themselves. Caleb, according to Louise, had started talking less about growth and more, in recent conversations with our parents, about finding a buyer, a strategic acquisition that would let the technology live on inside a larger, better capitalized company, even if Fenwick Root itself couldn't survive independently much longer. I didn't think much about any of this in relation to my own work. My firm operated in an entirely different part of the business world than my brother's software startup, and I had no particular reason to expect our paths would ever cross professionally. I didn't think much about any of this in relation to my own work. My firm operated in an entirely different part of the business world than my brother's software startup, and I had no particular reason to expect our paths would ever cross professionally. That changed on an ordinary Tuesday morning when Priya walked into my office holding a printed acquisition inquiry with an expression I couldn't quite read. I was reviewing quarterly numbers for one of our existing clients when she knocked, and I remember glancing up, expecting one of our usual Tuesday morning check-ins, the small, routine business of running a 40-person firm. Instead, she closed the door behind her, which she almost never did, and set the papers on my desk with a careful deliberateness that told me, before she'd said a word, that this wasn't a routine matter at all. "We got an inbound approach," she said, setting the papers on my desk. "A logistics software company looking for a strategic acquirer, someone who could absorb their platform and their remaining client contracts. Their advisory firm reached out to us directly because of our footprint in regional logistics operations." She paused, watching my face carefully. "Margaret, the company is called Fenwick Root." I sat very still for a long moment, looking at the papers on my desk, at my brother's company name printed in careful business language, describing itself as an innovative logistics technology platform seeking a strategic partner to maximize value for its remaining stakeholders. I asked Priya, who had signed the inquiry on Fenwick Root's behalf. She turned to the second page and pointed to a signature block near the bottom. "Caleb Halden, Founder and Chief Executive Officer." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters more than any dramatic reaction I could describe. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel a surge of vindication the way you might expect from a story like this one. I felt, mostly, a strange, quiet stillness. The same stillness I remembered from sitting in my car outside my apartment 8 years earlier, still in my wedding dress, understanding for the first time exactly where I stood in my family's accounting of who deserved investment. I felt that same clarity again, except this time I was the one holding the ledger. Priya asked me, carefully, whether I wanted her to handle the initial review herself, given the family connection, an offer I appreciated more than she probably realized. I told her no, that I wanted to see the full financials myself before we made any decision, and I want to walk you through what those financials showed, because they told a story far more complete than anything Louise's occasional updates had ever conveyed. Fenwick Root was, by any reasonable operational standard, in serious trouble. The company had burned through nearly all of its remaining capital, had lost 3 of its 5 largest client contracts over the previous 18 months due to what the financial disclosures politely called service reliability issues, and was carrying debt against its remaining assets that left almost no equity value for existing shareholders in any acquisition scenario short of a genuinely desperate sale. Caleb, the disclosures showed, had continued drawing a founder's salary throughout the decline that a company in that financial condition had no reasonable basis for paying. A detail that told me almost everything I needed to know about how the last several years had actually gone inside that company, regardless of how the story had been told at family dinners. I called Louise that evening, not to gossip, but because I genuinely wanted to understand the full picture before I made any decision about how to proceed. She confirmed what I already suspected, that my parents had continued supporting Caleb financially in smaller, quieter ways over the past several years. Money for payroll gaps, money for a lease renewal, money that Louise believed, though she couldn't say for certain, had eaten significantly into whatever retirement savings my parents had left. "Your father's 68 now, Margaret," Louise told me. "I don't think there's much left in that account. I think Caleb's company has been eating your parents alive for a decade, and I don't think either of your parents has ever once let themselves say that out loud." I sat with that information for several days before deciding what to do next. I want to be clear about something, the same way Eleanor was clear about her own reasoning in a similar moment years ago, because I've come to believe it matters enormously in stories like this one. I did not decide to pursue this acquisition as revenge. Fenwick Root's technology, stripped of Caleb's mismanagement, actually had real value, a genuinely useful route optimization engine that, integrated properly into my firm's existing client operations, could meaningfully improve outcomes for companies I already worked with. The acquisition made legitimate business sense entirely independent of who happened to be sitting on the other side of the table. But I also understood, sitting in my office reviewing those financials, that acquiring Fenwick Root would require sitting across from my brother in a negotiation for the first time in either of our adult lives, and that whatever happened in that room was going to force a reckoning neither of us had ever had the courage to have directly. I asked Priya to prepare a formal due diligence process, treated with exactly the same rigor we applied to any other acquisition target. No favors, no shortcuts, nothing that could later be characterized as either unfair advantage or excessive generosity extended because of family. I wanted, more than almost anything else in that entire process, for the numbers to speak entirely for themselves. The due diligence took 6 weeks. What it confirmed, in exhaustive detail, was that Fenwick Root's remaining value existed almost entirely in its underlying technology and a handful of loyal client relationships, and almost nowhere else. The company's operational infrastructure was a mess, built and rebuilt hastily across a decade of pivots with no coherent long-term architecture. Its cap table was a tangle of investor agreements from multiple funding rounds, several of which included aggressive liquidation preferences that meant, in any realistic sale scenario, the earliest investors and the company's debt holders would be paid first, leaving little to nothing for common shareholders, including Caleb himself. I spent several evenings that month reading through the diligence materials myself rather than delegating the full review to my deal team, something I rarely did anymore at this stage in my career. There was a strange, private grief in it, reading spreadsheet after spreadsheet documenting a decade of my brother's decisions, watching the specific moments where a company with genuinely promising technology had made choice after choice that prioritized appearance over substance, growth headlines over sustainable operations, the kind of decisions that are easy to make when you've never once had to face real consequences for making them. I thought, more than once during those evenings, about the science camp check my mother wrote without hesitation when I was 14, and the debate team fee I paid myself with babysitting money, and how directly those two small decisions, multiplied across 2 entire childhoods, seemed to explain everything sitting in front of me on my desk now. I asked Priya to schedule the negotiation meeting for a Thursday morning at our own offices, the way we handled every acquisition discussion. I told her not to mention to Caleb's advisory firm that I would personally be present rather than delegating the meeting to our deal team, the way I sometimes did with smaller acquisitions. I wanted to see his face when he walked into that conference room. I want to walk you through that meeting now, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Caleb arrived with his advisory firm's lead banker, a polished young man named Julian Voss, who had clearly been hired specifically to project confidence Fenwick Root's own financials no longer supported. Priya greeted them in the lobby and walked them back toward our main conference room, and I watched, through the glass wall of my office, the exact moment Caleb saw the name on the door. Halden Strategic Partners, printed in the same clean, unpretentious lettering that marked every office in our building. I want to describe that moment carefully, because I've replayed it in my mind more times than I probably should admit. Caleb was mid-sentence with Julian, gesturing at something on his phone, the easy, practiced confidence of a founder who had spent a decade pitching rooms full of people. He glanced up at the lobby, signage the way you glance at anything unfamiliar, and then his eyes moved past it, toward the glass wall of my office, and found me sitting at my desk. He stopped walking for a moment. I watched him read the name again, watched some slow, uncertain recognition move across his face, the particular expression of a man doing arithmetic he very much did not want to be doing. By the time he reached the conference room and saw me sitting at the head of the table, the recognition had fully arrived, and whatever confidence Julian Voss had spent the walkover trying to project had entirely drained out of my brother's face. "Margaret," he said, and it was the first time he'd said my name directly to me in nearly 2 years. "Caleb," I said, and I gestured to the chair across from me, the way I gestured to any acquisition target's representative. "Please, sit. I understand Fenwick Root is looking for a strategic partner." Julian Voss, to his credit, recovered faster than Caleb did, launching into the prepared pitch he'd clearly rehearsed, emphasizing the platform's technical strengths, the loyal client relationships, the significant upside for any acquirer with the operational capacity to properly scale what Fenwick Root had built. I let him finish the entire pitch without interruption, the same courtesy I extended to every party in a negotiation before I laid out, calmly and in exhaustive detail, exactly what our due diligence had found. The 3 lost major contracts over the previous 18 months and the specific operational failures behind each loss. The debt structure that left almost no equity value for common shareholders in any realistic sale. The founder's salary that had continued throughout a period of severe financial distress. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't need to. I simply laid the numbers on the table, one document at a time, the way you'd lay out evidence, and watched Caleb's face grow paler with each page. "You've clearly done your homework," Julian Voss said finally, and I could hear, underneath his professional composure, the sound of a banker recalculating exactly how much leverage his client had left in this room. He glanced at Caleb, a quick, assessing look, The kind bankers give clients when they're realizing the deal they'd hoped to broker is going to look very different from the one they pitched to their own firm's partners before walking in. I always do, I said. Given what the diligence shows, here's what we're prepared to offer. I named a figure, fair by any objective market standard, but far below what Fenwick Root's advisory materials had originally suggested the company might command. A number that reflected the technology's genuine value while accounting honestly for the operational and financial distress the company was actually in. This offer would cover the outstanding debt in full and provide a modest return to preferred investors under their liquidation preferences. It would not leave meaningful proceeds for common shareholders, including you, Caleb. I want to be direct about that before you consider it further. Caleb sat very still across the table from me, the way I imagine I must have sat in my car 8 years earlier, absorbing a number that told him, in language he couldn't argue with, exactly what a decade of decisions had actually been worth. He opened his mouth once, as if to argue, then closed it again, looking down at the printed summary in front of him instead, running his finger along a line item the way you'd touch a bruise to see if it still hurt. "This is because of the wedding," he said quietly, and it was the first thing he'd said in several minutes. "You're doing this because of what happened." I looked at my brother for a long moment before answering. "No, Caleb," I said. "I'm offering fair market value for a company in genuine financial distress, the same offer I'd make to any acquisition target in this condition. If you want to know what happened because of the wedding, it's this. I spent 8 years building something entirely on my own, without a single dollar of the support you received for a decade, and it turned out to be worth more than the thing that support was poured into. That's not revenge. That's just what the numbers actually say when nobody's thumb is on the scale anymore." Julian Voss asked for time to consult with the board and the preferred investors, the standard request in a moment like that one. And I told him, of course, take whatever time you need. And the meeting ended not with shouting or dramatic accusations, but with the particular quiet of two people finally seeing each other clearly for the first time in a very long while. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks and months that followed, because the aftermath, once again, mattered just as much as the meeting itself. Fenwick Root's board accepted our offer 6 weeks later, after exploring, unsuccessfully, whether any other acquirer might value the company more generously. There wasn't one. Our offer, as it turned out, was the only serious proposal on the table, a fact that told its own story about how the broader market had come to view what Caleb had built. The deal closed quietly, the technology and client relationships absorbed into our firm's operations over the following several months, several of Fenwick Root's remaining engineers joining our team, where, under proper operational discipline, the route optimization technology finally began delivering the value it had always technically been capable of. Caleb received almost nothing from the sale, exactly as the numbers had predicted. I didn't gloat about that, and I want to be honest that I didn't feel much satisfaction in it either, mostly just a tired, familiar sadness at watching a decade of a person's life amount to so little. Not because he lacked talent, but because he had never once been required to build anything with real stakes attached, and by the time the stakes finally arrived, he had no idea how to meet them. I saw him once more before the deal fully closed, at our parents' house, an awkward, quiet dinner neither of us had really wanted to attend. He looked smaller than I remembered him looking, not physically, but in some other way, the particular deflation of a person who has spent a decade being told he was destined for something and has now had to sit with the arithmetic that says otherwise. He didn't apologize to me that night, not directly, though at one point, when our parents had stepped into the kitchen, he said, quietly, without quite looking at me, "I used to tell myself you didn't need it as much as I did, that you were the strong one, so it evened out somehow. I didn't have a response ready for that. I still don't know if I do." I told him only that strength was never actually the thing being measured, and he nodded slowly, the way you nod at something you're not yet ready to fully understand. My parents called me the week the deal closed, my mother first, her voice careful and uncertain in a way I'd genuinely never heard from her before. "Margaret," she said, "I don't fully understand everything that happened, but Caleb told us. Your company bought his." "It did," I said. There was a long silence on the line. "We're proud of you," she said finally, and something in her voice cracked slightly on the words. "We should have said that a long time ago, and we should have been in those 2 chairs at your wedding instead of wherever we actually were that morning. I think about that morning more than you probably know." I didn't tell her everything was forgiven in that conversation, because it wasn't, not entirely. Not in a single phone call after 8 years of silence and a decade of watching my brother receive a kind of investment I had never once been offered. But I told her I appreciated her saying it, and I told her that Nathaniel and I would be open to seeing them, cautiously, the way you approach any relationship you're rebuilding, rather than assuming can simply resume where it left off. We have dinner now, occasionally, my parents and Nathaniel and me. The first one was tense in ways I hadn't fully prepared myself for. My mother overcompensating with questions about my firm that felt, at first, almost rehearsed, the way you'd study material for a test you were afraid of failing. But something in her seemed to soften across those dinners as the months passed, a genuine curiosity replacing the performance of it, and I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, gradually letting my guard down enough to actually tell her about the parts of my work I was proud of. The operational turnarounds that had saved companies, the employees I'd hired straight out of school who'd grown into, leadership roles under my mentorship. She listened, really listened, in a way I don't think she ever had before, and I understood, watching her across the table one evening, that some part of her had simply never known how, until circumstances finally forced the question to look at me and see anything other than the daughter who had always managed just fine on her own. Caleb wasn't at the first few dinners, though he came to one last spring, quiet and subdued in a way I'd genuinely never seen from him growing up. Working now, I learned, as a mid-level operations manager at a logistics company 2 states away. A job he apparently took, according to my mother, specifically because he wanted to understand how the operational side of a business actually worked before he ever tried to build something of his own again. I don't know if that's true, or if it's simply the version of events that's easiest for my parents to tell themselves. I've stopped needing to know for certain. Some things, I've learned, you simply have to let people work out on their own timeline, if they work them out at all. I think often about those 2 empty folding chairs, the printed cards that said Mother of the Bride and Father of the Bride sitting untouched through an entire ceremony. I think about how much of my adult life I spent trying to understand exactly what I would have needed to do, or be, or achieve, to earn the kind of investment my parents extended to my brother without a second thought. I understand now, in a way I couldn't have understood at 29, that the answer was never really about me at all. It was about a story my parents had been telling themselves since Caleb was a child, a story about which of their children represented the family's future, and it took a company built entirely without their help, absorbing the company built entirely with it, for that story to finally, quietly, correct itself. I don't know if my parents ever fully understand what those years cost me. The wedding photographs with 2 empty chairs still visible in the background of every wide shot. The quiet ache of building an entire career without a single person from my childhood ever thinking to ask a follow-up question about it. I've made a kind of peace with that uncertainty, the same way I've made peace with a great many things about my family that will probably never be resolved as cleanly as I once hoped they would be. Peace, I've learned, doesn't always look like a full explanation or a perfect apology. Sometimes it just looks like 2 people, finally, sitting at the same table again, choosing to keep showing up even after everything that happened. Here's what I want you to take from this, if you take anything at all. If your family has already decided who deserves the investment and who doesn't, you don't have to spend your life trying to argue your way into a different answer. Sometimes the most honest response isn't a confrontation at all. It's simply building something real, patiently, on your own terms, until the numbers themselves become impossible to argue with. That's my story. If you've ever sat in the version of those 2 empty chairs, watching people choose someone else's future over showing up for yours, I hope you find your own way to build something that speaks for itself. And if this reminded you that quiet, steady work is still work, even when nobody in the room is watching it happen, I hope you keep going anyway. Thank you for listening.